This is the word of the Lord from Psalm 132. It's a long one, so get in a posture of listening. Lord, remember David and all his self-denial. He swore an oath to the Lord. He made a vow to the Mighty One of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will allow no sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling for the Mighty One of Jacob. We heard it in Ephrathah. We came upon it in the fields of Jar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool, saying, Arise, Lord, and come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. May your priests be clothed with your righteousness. May your faithful people sing for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath he would not revoke. One of your own descendants I will place on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne forever and ever. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling, saying, This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation, and her faithful people will ever sing for joy. Here I will make a horn grow for David and set up a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head will be adorned with a radiant crown. This is the word of the Lord from Psalm 132.
Ezra, many of you saw, my 4-year-old, I asked him if I could share this story. So he's getting old enough, I feel like I need to ask him if I can share stories about him. I don't know. I'm trying to raise him so he doesn't, look back on all these memories like, why'd you tell my stories when I was a kid? Anyway, I asked him if I could tell a story. He said yes. So he is a massive Cincinnati Bengals fan. As his father before him and his grandfather before as so it shall be for our entire family. That's just the way it is. We love the Bengals, and this story will have no impact on your life, so other than maybe hopefully the point that I'm sort of aiming at with it, so you can forget all of this. It's not really that important. But Ezra came to me the other day with that in mind, in that context. I was sitting on the couch, and he said, Hey, Dad. He likes to wear Cincinnati Bengals jerseys, play football in the living room. He said, Hey, Dad, the Bengals always go to the Super Bowl. My poor son, right? He has no idea what he's in for on this road. But because I'm a good father and I don't want him to grow up in a world of lies, I told him, actually, Ezra, the Bengals, they've only been in the Super Bowl 3 times since they became a team in 1967. Those numbers mean nothing to him. Time is a bit nebulous to a 4-year-old. So I said, that's 3 times in the last 55 years that the Bengals have actually gone to the Super Bowl. He looked at me kind of weirdly, and I said, the Bengals only go to the Super Bowl 5% of the time. He also was like, percentages, I don't get it. I said, let me put it in perspective for you. The last time the Bengals went to the Super Bowl, I was your brother's age. He was 2. And it was 1988. So don't get your hopes up, kid. Like, this is not true. And to top it all off, I said, when they do go to the Super Bowl, they have this wonderful tradition of losing. So it's going to be a rough road. Don't get too excited. Your experience is not necessarily true, right? Some of you would hear me tell that story and be like, well, why did you tell your 4-year-old that? Like, you stole his joy. You're a bad father. Kristen may agree with you on that. I'm not really sure. But I think I gave him a gift. And the gift that I think I gave him is the gift of seeing that reality is bigger than his experience of it. Does that make sense? He's been able to be a football fan for 1 year. He hit the lottery, the Bengals won the Super Bowl, right? It doesn't happen. It's not a thing, right? And the truth is, that may sound like bad news if your only experience of fandom is a Super Bowl when you were 3. But that story, the truth, the sort of bigger perspective, the bigger picture, it might actually be a really hopeful view if you say, I don't know, if you're like a Tennessee football fan or something. Sorry, now that I've alienated everyone. It's been a rough ride for the Vols recently. But there is hope. There's hope. That's what that story means for you. There's hope, right? And now that I've alienated the majority of you and telling you that, the point of the story has nothing to do with football. The point of the story has everything to do with perspective and history and our own limited experience of it. Does that make sense? Ezra's experience as a short-lived Bengals fan, while real, trust me, it's very real. You can't take it from us. It happened. It wasn't exactly true. Does that make sense? It's real, but it's not exactly true. And as a father, I want him to know what is ultimately true. And why, you would ask. Why have the conversation? Why talk about this? I think I want to know it's true, and I want us to know what's true, because when we know this true story of something, it helps us respond appropriately in the moment. Have you been in that situation? The thing is, you see, Ezra and I celebrated differently, mainly because I'm 36 and he's 4, but also because our experience is different. When the Bengals won the game to go to the Super Bowl, for him it was cool, and he was excited about it. For me, it was 34 years of futility erased in a moment. Like, I sat for hours after the Bengals won the AFC Championship, and I know some of you don't care about football, and just stay with me. This is also going to say something about me. I sat for hours after they won that game, scrolling through Twitter, watching reaction videos of grown men my age crying, weeping over a football game. There was a depth and a passion and a reality and an experience there that Ezra just couldn't connect to because he was 4, and the first time he cheered for a football team, they went to the Super Bowl. When we know the full story, it gives us a perspective on something that is bigger than our own experience or our own emotions can give us, right? So I told Ezra all of that, and he went away. This is like one of the biggest wins of me being a father recently. So he came back a couple days later, and he was playing football again. Same situation. I was sitting on the couch. He's wearing his jersey, throwing the football to himself. And he comes back, and he said, "Hey, Dad, it's really cool that the Bengals played in the Super Bowl." And I said, "Yeah, bud, it was really, really cool, and I'm glad they did." You see the perspective shift, right, when you get a little bit of context. And I think Psalm 32 does that in a way more significant, a way bigger, in a way more important way, right? It tells a story, it gives a history that helps us connect with something that's bigger than we could ever experience in our own sort of lives and moment, right? And it doesn't necessarily even tell a story as much as it reminds the Hebrew pilgrims that were journeying to Jerusalem to have an encounter with Yahweh that they would have known. It's a story they would have known, but it's something much greater, much less trivial than a football game. And I think if you've been tracking with us over the last couple of months, this psalm, as Sarah read it, this is one of the more unique psalms in the Songs of Ascent, right? Psalm 120 to 135, the Songs of Ascent, the songs that the Hebrew people would sing on their way to Jerusalem, on their way to encounter 3 times a year, every year, as they went to celebrate festivals in Jerusalem. It's one of the more unique ones, not just because of its length. It is the longest that we've encountered so far on our journey. But I do think if we'll lean in, the perspective here is something that we could really benefit from. I think there's some hope and some excitement for us if we'll set together with it in the reality of what is Palm Sunday as we look forward to the next week, to Easter weekend, together to celebrate something that happened in the past that informs not only our present but also the future in which toward which the world is heading. You see, the psalm tells an interesting story, or recounts an interesting story. But the purpose in singing it is not a history lesson, right? This isn't like, hey, we're marching to Jerusalem together on this pilgrimage. Here's a little historical nugget that you missed, right? It's not like Hebrew summer school, like I missed this in 9th grade, like Israelite history, so now I'm going to pick it up on the way during this like religious festival, right? It's not an elective that we're taking to learn more about the history of Israel as we journey toward an encounter with Yahweh. If that was the purpose, the psalmist could have just said, hey, open up 2 Samuel, read the story of David finding the Ark of the Covenant. He doesn't do that. If that's the purpose, then it's a bad history lesson. The psalm doesn't necessarily tell us the story, it just reminds us of the story, right? But the purpose of the Songs of Ascent, again, is to remind Israel who they are, to remind them of who the God they're going to encounter in Jerusalem is, and the transformation that he wants to work in their lives as they walk the path of the pilgrim together, as they live life together under God's vision for human existence. That's why when we've read the Psalms, this one's unique because it doesn't necessarily do what the other ones have done, right? The Songs of Ascent that have come before, they talk about things like joy and provision and repentance and suffering and work and service, all things that we can kind of get our minds around as we think about what does it mean for me to be a disciple of Jesus? The parts of my life that I'm submitting to him, or the things that he wants to do, the transformation that he wants to work in my heart. These are the kind of topics that the Psalms talked about. And we can connect them, I think, maybe more easily to discipleship than we can this psalm this morning. Because this psalm is a reminder of a historical reality that comes from a church or from a culture that is completely and totally foreign to most of us in the room, right? So it's a little bit harder to access for us. I mean, many of you would say that you know at least who King David is, right? Some of you may not have an experience in church. You may be like, I don't know, King David, maybe. But some of us, our knowledge of this story may start and end with King David, right? He was the king of Israel. He was complicated. He was a broken man after God's own heart, that whole thing, right? But what did David do that the psalm is reminding us of? Well, the psalm says that he found a dwelling place for the Lord. Like, what is that even? Like, what's that mean? And now they're singing about this moment while they heard the news while they were at a town called Ephrathah. And like, how many of you hung out in Ephrathah this weekend? Like, anybody know where that is? What that even is? Like, how to even pronounce it? I had to Google it. Like, and then he talks about like they're going to take the Lord's resting place to Jerusalem. I mean, like, if we're honest, there's this history, there's this moment in history that's significant for this group of people that we can't really connect to. So if it's a history lesson that the psalmist is setting out to tell us, it's a bad one. But what if the psalmist is trying to do something different? What if the psalm is aimed at something different this morning? I think that is what makes this so intriguing to me. What if instead of telling a story from history, Psalm 132 has as its goal to connect history to hope, to link the celebrated past with the certain future, and to remind so that Israel might continually reinvent themselves faithfully in the light of what God has done in the past. I think that is the aim of Psalm 132, and that makes it much more intriguing to me. I think the invitation as we sit on Palm Sunday looking toward Easter Sunday is to realize that there are stories in the biblical text that function as this story functioned for Israel, to give these pilgrims more resources than just their own small set of experiences, their own short lives, and their very limited memories when it comes to living life well in relationship to King Jesus, right? More than a simple retelling of something that happened hundreds of years earlier. I think Psalm 132 wants to connect God's work in the past to what is to come in the future, and to locate these people right at the center of it in the present. Does that make sense? And I go, man, if we could learn to read our Bibles that way, if we could learn to lean into the words of God that way, as a telling of a story that happened in the past that points to a certain future that locates us right in the middle of it in the present, I think revival would begin to break out in our homes, in our lives, in our cities. And I think the thing I want us to see this morning is that a crucial part of discipleship to Jesus, one of the most beautiful invitations that he offers us that we miss out so many times because of our individualistic cultural moment, is to connect our lives to a story of faithfulness and redemption and love, a story that gives us resources beyond our own narrow set of experiences for understanding and living well in the world. That's why we gather. That's why we read an ancient book. That's why we tell ancient stories. That's why we read liturgies together, to be shaped into a picture of what God would do among us, to have resources given to our lives that we don't possess on our own, right? Because I think our memories are too short, our experiences are too limited, and our perspectives are too small. Our feelings are too fleeting to help us fully evaluate our lives and to give them to what actually matters in the world. I don't know if that's been your experience or not, but it's been mine. And on the Sunday before Easter, what a better gift to receive than to be reminded, along with the Hebrew pilgrims of old, that all we celebrate this week, it actually happened. And that because it happened, all that God has promised will too. That's the gift I think a psalm like this one can give us in the midst of Holy Week. So quickly, let's talk about what is the story that the psalm is telling, and why is it important for us this morning to lean into it as people who want to be formed in discipleship as we follow Jesus into life with God. So we've been reading a book together. A lot of this has been kind of coming out of Eugene Peterson's work in a book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. He says that Psalm 132, in that book, he says that Psalm 132's purpose is twofold. The first is this: it helps us keep our feet on the ground, right? Helps us keep our feet on the ground of reality of what's actually happened, and roots our ability to be obedient in historical fact. Now I'll talk about obedience for a minute, because a lot of us hear that word and we freak out, right? It's like, oh, Matt's talking about obedience again. Like we see God as like this overbearing father, and it's like, be obedient, do what I say. Obedience in the biblical sort of picture that we get is this picture of living life according to God's vision for our life and flourishing. When the scriptures talk about obedience, it's submitting our lives to God's picture and God's view and vision for what human life could and should and will be when done with him. Does that make sense? It's not God just standing in heaven saying, like, hey, here's a rule, follow it, because I want to see if you're good at obeying. Like, obedience is submitting our lives to God's will for our lives. And we do that through the practices and through gathering and through spiritual disciplines and through following King Jesus in discipleship. So obedience is rooted, hear this, in historical fact. So this psalm is sort of naming for us and inviting us to see. And I think that's a powerful word because I don't know about you, I'll just speak about myself for a minute. The tendency that I feel that I live into sometimes, for me at least, is to root my obedience not in historical facts, not in God's vision for my life, but in my experience of the moment. In other words, my ability to live into God's vision for my life is highly dependent upon my current circumstances, my mood, my economic situation, my relationship status, my kids' behavior, like you name it. So often, my ability to live into God's vision for my life and the invitation of Jesus to the light, to the easy yoke, to the way of discipleship is impacted more by those things than it is by what God has done historically. Does that make sense? Maybe I'm the only one, right? I think Psalm 132 offers us a better way to live than that. Because remember, this is given to a group of people who were singing as they walked a journey together, a really long journey, like the OG road trip, right? Was walking uphill to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And to those people, a group tired of walking, a group of people who on the road fought with their spouses, who were angry at their kids, annoyed, sunburnt, hungry, hangry, distracted, shame-filled. Like, can you imagine going on a pilgrimage thinking, like, how can I even be on a pilgrimage when I did the night before we left? Like, I think shame is magnified. Try going on a pilgrimage, right? To us, to people like that, it's said, hey, your ability to live in God's vision for your life, like God's good invitation to you this morning, is not rooted in your experience of the moment, but in history. Like historically. It's rooted in the security of his response historically to those who have chosen obedience to what he said. Maybe the story will help bring it out. So Psalm 132, it reminds Israel of a moment in their history, a moment from their collective past, a moment in which the Ark of the Covenant, you guys familiar with the Ark of the Covenant? So the Ark of the Covenant was a box, a really fancy box with some really important things in it and on it, given to Israel at their encounter with God on Mount Sinai. And it was the place that represented God's presence among them. They literally carried it everywhere with them, before them. They carry it as they wander through the desert for 40 years with them. They carry it across the Jordan River. It's an amazing story. We talk about it on our 4th birthday as a church, right? They carry it across the Jordan River before the people of God cross. The presence of God crosses, and the Ark of the Covenant stands in the middle of the river as the people cross through. It's the reminder of God's promise and presence and faithful work among them. It travels before the people as they conquer the promised land. It's been with Israel through every moment, every significant moment of their history from the time they left Egypt until they arrive in the promised land. There was no artifact more precious to the people of God than the Ark of the Covenant. And they messed around and lost it in a battle with the Philistines, which is not great. There's a moment in their history, right? The Philistines come upon them. They take the Ark of the Covenant. They defeat Israel because of some sin and other things. They take the Ark of the Covenant with them, the Philistines do, which is bad. It's bad. The Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant for a little while, and they take it back to Israel because the presence of God will not leave them alone. It's kind of an amazing story, right? So they take the Ark of the Covenant, like, we don't want it anymore. They literally drive to the border. They don't drive. They go to the border with Israel. They drop it off in some, unknown village. Like, we don't want it anymore. Like, we can't handle the presence of Yahweh among us. It's causing us a lot of problems. Take it back. So it's lost, kind of, because they just drop it. They, drive to the border, kick it out, and, go. And so there's this moment in Israel's history where David, they find out that the Ark of the Covenant, this important relic of their past, this symbol of God's presence with him, is lost in some out of the way town. And David makes a vow before the Lord. That's what we're reading. David made a vow before the Lord to not go into his house, to not sleep until he gets the Ark of the Covenant and he returns to Jerusalem. And this psalm is the reminder of that moment when David goes and he gets the Ark of the Covenant and he takes it back to Jerusalem. It's this moment, the symbolic moment in the history of Israel that's to deal with the restoration of the unity of Israelite worship, where the presence of God, the thing that held the presence of God, is brought into the temple. And it's a reunification of Israelite worship. It's this massively important moment in their history. It's a symbolic fixing of all of the past disunity and brokenness and bad times. It's a psalm that reminds them of the story when the very ark that had accompanied Israel in her best moments and in her worst moments was rediscovered and put finally in the place it always was meant to be. It's this big moment. And they're singing about it on the way to Jerusalem, on the way to encounter Yahweh in the very place that the Ark of the Covenant was carried to. It's a moment that puts Israel's whole history as a nation in perspective for us. And now we gather with a group of pilgrims around this text, people journeying toward an encounter with God, called to remember this particular moment in history. Why? Why this one? Out of all of them, why this one? I think for a lot of reasons, but I think mainly because this song, the remembrance of that story of David's oath and his vow and his obedience to live into what God had called him into, has the power to revive historical memories, and hear this, and to help those who have never experienced that moment translate it into their own lives. It's reaching into the past and it's saying, hey, here's something that God did in the past. And it's to be brought forward and brought to bear on your life in the present, just as it shapes the future reality that we're all walking to. Do you see the power of that moment, of that remembering, right? It's the same sort of remembering that we do as we gather around the table of Jesus and take communion together. We're just remembering historical fact. We're participating in something that happened in the past that shapes the future, that locates us in the middle of God's work in the present. You see, they're walking the same paths, Eugene Peterson says, that the ark traveled as it was returned, or as it was brought to the temple. It's a reminder to them that as they walk those paths, they aren't the first ones to do so. And that they won't be the last ones to do so either. Peterson says, up these same roads, along these same paths, the ark had been carried, accompanied by a determined and expectant people. Do you hear that? Accompanied by a determined and expectant people. Then he says, obedience has a history. And if we define obedience too narrowly, we miss it, right? Living in God's vision for life has a history in which he has been faithful. And the hard times have come and difficult moments have passed, but he's been faithful. And the ark was brought to the place it was always meant to be, out of what seemed like astronomical chances for that to have happened. You see, when the road seems hard to walk for the pilgrims, when the hills seem too steep, when the dangers are too real, it's really helpful to know that others have walked here before us and that we can, as they did, make it where we are going. Anybody ever felt that way? Like no one in the history of humanity has gone through what I've gone through. It's not true. It's not true. And as the people of God, like no moment in human history has been more difficult to be a Christian. That's not true. Like I'll just tell you, it's not true. It's not. It's not. It doesn't mean it's not hard. Doesn't mean there aren't certain things allied against the kingdom of God. That will always be true. What it means is that he was faithful then, and he'll be faithful now, and he will be faithful to bring his kingdom in its fullness one day. That's what we can be sure of in the history of God. It tells us that. So I think the word for us this morning is a simple one, right? I think it's important as we sit here looking at Easter next week together, as we think about the people in our lives who desperately need to encounter the hope of the resurrection that we celebrate on Easter, right? Finding ourselves caught up in God's history helps us respond appropriately in the moment. That's the teaching. That's it. It keeps us from both, hear this, overreacting and underreacting. It helps us respond appropriately to what's happening in our lives and in our cities and in our world. It helps us to not despair, but to also not sit on our hands. It helps us respond faithfully, powerfully, gracefully in the moment when we know the story that our lives have been caught up in all week. You see, I've been thinking about this all week. Like, why in a group of psalms, the songs of Ascent, aimed at spiritual formation, aimed at formation on the journey of discipleship, is there one that just seems to be recounting a story that, like I said earlier, we could just open our Bibles to 2 Samuel and read. You should. It's an amazing story. But why? Like, why spend the extra paper, right? Like, they didn't have word processors, so you write something down significant, you know? It's not like I'll copy paste. Like, why? The story's already in there. Why? But it's not just a retelling of the story. I think I've realized this week that it's because understanding the history of that story and the history of the story that we are a part of is essential for us to walk well in that story in the present. We have to know it. We're a storied people. We are people shaped by stories. Because here's the thing about human life, I think you all know this to be true, about the way we think and live. It's pretty universal to human experience. It's the truth that we learn from our experiences. And none of you are like, Matt is he's a genius in psychology because I didn't come up with that. Like you know it to be true. You learn from your experiences, right? It's how we learn. It's one of the chief ways that we learn. Some would say the primary way that we learn is through our experiences. You can tell us what's true. We can read it in a book and we can experience something. And what do you think I'm going to tell you is truer? The thing that I've experienced, right? We learn from our experiences. So Ezra, again, I asked him permission on this one as well. Ezra, when he was a year old, we took him to Thanksgiving. at my great aunt's house. And I have to be careful how I tell a story because there's a chance that she would like watch this on YouTube or something. So we took Ezra to my great aunt's house in Ohio, and my aunt's dog, Travis, he's a Shih Tzu. I don't know if you can say that breed in church, a Shih Tzu. Sorry, that was a dad joke. So like a tiny dog, like tiny white dog, nipped at Ezra. It's probably not Travis's fault. Ezra was one. I think he was like pulling his tail or something. I don't really know. But he tried to bite Ezra. And not much longer later on in his life, a couple months maybe, we were at Brooks and Mabry's house. And Ezra was running around playing in the backyard, and he was playing with Moose, their dog, who is a very good boy. I will have no Moose slander. He's great. But Ezra was running, and Moose is a dog, and he thought Ezra was playing with him, and he gently jumped up and put his paws on Ezra's back and helped him gently to the ground. Ezra's 4, and we are still unlearning all those experiences. The issue is for Ezra that he can't do anything but process his relationship to any dog in the world through his experiences with dogs up until this point in his life. And so as a father, hopefully a good one, I'm trying to teach Ezra that not every dog is the dog that nipped at him, right? Not every dog is the dog that bit you. It's a fundamental truth of life that we have to learn. But our minds are wired, like literally made to create beliefs and values out of our experiences. And so why do I tell you all of that? Because if that's true, the only way to challenge experience that have led to beliefs about life is to have a different experience. That's why the Christian call to community is so powerful. Because oftentimes the very place of our wounding becomes the only place in which we can experience healing when we have experiences there that undo or challenge or replace the negative experiences that we've had. I recognize that's hard. I'm not just saying dive back into the places of your wounding. I'd be a bad dad if I didn't put some safety guards around next time we were with Travis, the dog, right? Like, go back and do it again, Ezra. That'd be great. Reinforcement, right? But the truth is, at the same time, Ezra would also be diminished if he never went back to Thanksgiving. Is that true? That if he never got to experience that again because there was a dog that bit him one time there, he would be diminished. His life would be less than it could have been. You see what I'm saying with that? So as a father, I'm trying to get Ezra to have good experience with the dogs every chance I get. So if you have a nice dog, please let us come over and hang out. I'm trying. They're like, we want a dog. I'm like, you don't want a dog. Like, you say you want a dog. I've seen how you act around dogs. You definitely don't want one. Which is great in this case. Why? Because there's a lot of dogs in the world, a lot of good ones, and he's young and we have plenty of time and opportunity. This is good, right? But another dynamic I think that's even more important and I think more relevant to what we're talking about today is this, that humans also have the unique ability not just to learn from our experiences, but to learn from the experiences of others that we're around. It's another powerful way that we learn. We either have the experience or we see someone have the experience, like, I definitely don't want that, right? I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there. I do want to do that, or I do want to experience that sort of thing. We have the ability to learn through the experiences of others. This can be illustrated clearly by the fact that my other son, Maddox, has never once in his life ever had a negative experience with a dog. Ever. But he's learned quite well from his brother that they are terrifying. And so we walk into a house with a dog and we're like, we can't even stay here, man. Like, I got to sit in the car. Maddox has never had a bad experience with a dog, but his brother has. And Maddox has learned through that experience, right? The good news is, though, this works in the opposite way as well. And this is what I think Psalm 132 opens a door for us into this morning. That we can leverage the resources and experiences and wisdom gained by those who have come before us and lived through the things that we are facing now. And we can apply them in our discipleship to King Jesus, that we can learn from them, that we find ourselves caught up in that story as well. And this is one of the key realities. This is why I think this psalm is in the middle of a discussion on discipleship and formation, right? Because it's one of the key realities of discipleship to King Jesus that we don't take hold of, that our individualistic moment blinds us to. It's robbed us of that ability. You see, it isn't a history book as much as it is a book that contains the communal learned wisdom and experience of people who have been doing life with Yahweh for thousands of years. That's why we read this. That's why we don't just gather in an open encyclopedia about, the early temple period, or the second temple period, or ancient Near East. Like, we read this book specifically because it is a library of experience of what life with God looks like. That's why we read it. That's why we give it the authority that we do in our lives, because it shows what happens and what doesn't happen when we conform our lives to God's vision for them, and that's biblical obedience. Does that make sense? Here's how Eugene Peterson says it in his book that I referenced earlier. This is what he says about Psalm 132. I'm just going to put it on the screen and we're going to read it. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think it helps summarize so well, I think, what Psalm 132 is inviting us into this morning. So this is what Eugene Peterson says about Psalm 132. He says, this history, the one we're reading about in Psalm 132, the story of David and the ark, is important, for without it, we are at the mercy of whims. And he says, memory is a data bank we use to evaluate our position and make decisions. With a biblical memory, we have 2,000 years of experience from which to make the off-the-cuff responses that are required each day in the life of faith. And he says this, if we are going to live adequately and maturely as the people of God, we need more data to work from than our own experience can give us. And now he starts to preach a little bit, so if you get upset or uncomfortable, it's just Eugene, it's not me. You can take it up with him, and he's with the Lord, so good luck. He says, what would we think of the pollster who issued a definitive report on how American people felt about a new television special if we discovered later that he had interviewed only one person who had only seen 10 minutes of the program? We would dismiss the conclusions as frivolous. This is where if you're going to get uncomfortable, here you go. Yet that is exactly the kind of evidence that too many Christians accept as the final truth about many much more important matters. Matters such as answered prayer, God's judgment, Christ's forgiveness, eternal salvation. Take it easy, Eugene. The only person they consult is themselves. And the only experience they evaluate is the most recent 10 minutes. But we need other experiences. The community of experience of brothers and sisters in the church, the centuries of experience provided by our biblical ancestors, a Christian who has David in his bones, Jeremiah in his bloodstream, Paul in his fingertips, and Christ in his heart will know how much and how little value to put on his own momentary feelings and the experiences of the past week. Whew. See, when our present is firmly grounded in the history of God's faithfulness, in the future that God is bringing, we are freed up to bear faithful witness in the moment. And that faithful witness, being able to look out, not getting too high or too low, but understanding the trajectory of God's work in the world, that is what the Bible means when it speaks about obedience. Living within and under God's vision for humanity in every season, at every moment, come what may. This morning as we celebrate Palm Sunday and look forward to Easter, we come to realize, I think, maybe today more easily than others, that we need roots in a past that is bigger than us. We need roots in stories of God's faithfulness and deliverance and healing and restoration that can enable us to stand firm and to believe them even when our experience seems to put his faithfulness and love in question and doubt. We need to be reminded also of where that obedience, where that kind of life takes us, the direction that we're living into, so that we understand his work in our lives, that our lives are ultimately for the purpose of his glory and our joy as we walk faithfully in accordance to what he's done in the past. And so here's the teaching this morning for you. How many of us would affirm the call this morning to follow Jesus into the future of God? Like you're here because you want to give your life to that. You want to affirm the invitation into resurrection life, into the end of all brokenness and pain, into the peace of the Good Shepherd, into the victory of the Lamb, into the end of all oppression and marginalization, into the restoration and redemption of all things. I'm here for that. I think you are too, or else you'd be somewhere else on Sunday morning. That is the That is the future that our lives are being caught up in and that God is bringing and that we're getting to witness and experience even as we wait for the fullness of that. How many of us, even as we've talked about the songs of Ascent over the last 3 months, would have affirmed the call that we found in them to remember who we are, who God is, who we're encountering as we walk the path of discipleship behind King Jesus as a faithful teacher and guide along the way. We would affirm all of that, but at the end of the day, in spite of all of that, we still feel scared or alone or second-guessing Jesus' vision for our lives and our ability to walk in all that he has for us, especially when it gets difficult. Like, is it true? Actually, that's the thing. Like, in those moments, when the cultural moment changes and invites us to be obedient to a different story, to a different way of living, you see, all of the information in the world, if it stays only as head knowledge, facts on a page, a story that we've only interacted with in order to pass some sort of history test at the end, if it does that, all the information in the world only does us a certain amount of good. See, I can tell Ezra all day long that most dogs aren't mean. I can tell him all day long that the Bengals are just one of 32 football teams in the NFL that are sometimes good, not very often. Most of the time they're not. I can tell him that. But there will come a moment in every moment of life, and even in the moments that we've given to Jesus and discipleship, in which the information will fail us. Doesn't mean it won't be true, but it does mean that it won't be sufficient for what we're walking in. We'll forget it. Or our experience will shout that it's not true. And it's precisely in those moments that we need a psalm like this one. I think it's appropriate that it was given to a group of people in the middle of a pilgrimage. It's like, here's all the things we're working on, but here's the story you need to be reminded of, right? Like, in the middle of the transformation, it's helpful to remember, like, others have been here before. Others have gone this way before. This is not the end of your life, though it may seem like it in the moments of danger or difficulty or stress. You see, all of us need to be reminded when the way gets difficult that the very ark of the covenant has been carried on these paths that we walk. That in times that were darker and more difficult than our own, men and women of faith have walked here as well. And we need to remember that they were delivered just as we will be delivered to Yahweh himself for his glory and their joy. We need to remember that, though it hasn't been our experience. It's in those moments that we remind ourselves of God's work in the past, so that we may step together into his future. And when we don't, hear me this morning, if you don't hear anything else, hear this. I think this is true. I believe this is true with all of my heart. Then when we don't have the resources or the wisdom or the hope or any of it, we can borrow it from those who have come before us in the family of faith. Because the truth is that we are part of a people with a rich and a deep and a broad experience of God and his faithfulness. And I think that's true as we celebrate together on Palm Sunday, as we look forward to on Easter Sunday. That when Saturday comes, between death and resurrection, we have the story of the people of God who have gone before us that says God will not stay in the tomb. He won't. He won't. So as we close this morning on Palm Sunday, as we take communion, I just want to name the truth is that we take a meal that serves just as this psalm did for the people of God. That we take bread, and we take a cup, and we do it in remembrance of Jesus so that we might confront the lies of the moment with the truth of God's work in the past. When it feels like death has won, or brokenness has won, or injustice has won, or war has won, or oppression has won, we take this meal to remember that it hasn't. We remember actively with our lives, not just head knowledge, but a lived remembrance of God's work in the past, as it is connected to his promise to work again in the future and his very real presence with us in the moment. So this morning we're going to pray and then we'll take communion together. We every Sunday, whenever, we always want to. I said this at the beginning of the series on the Songs of Ascent. Part of the path of discipleship to King Jesus is an embrace of his death and his resurrection. So this morning we brought out the, what is that thing called? The trough, I guess. We'll fill it up with water this morning if anybody wants to be baptized. We'll do that every Sunday. So we want to bring it out, and in light of what we're talking about this morning, with an invitation to step into that as a practice of saying, I give my life to you, Jesus, right? Like Romans 6 says, if we've experienced a death like his, we'll experience resurrection like his. And so in baptism, we literally and figuratively and beautifully and theologically, we experience a death and a being raised to new life, right? And so we just want to put that out for you. If you want to be baptized this morning, that's always on the table, like whenever, in the middle of the week, 2 a.m., call me, like we'll go to the river, like we'll do it, like significant. But if like this morning, God's like, hey, like this is the thing I'm inviting you into. As we think about resurrection, as we think about practicing the way of Jesus, as we think about being buried and raised to new life as Jesus was buried and raised to new life that we celebrate next week in Easter, if you want that to be part of your story, we just want to let you know that's always on offer. So we're going to have it here this week. We'll have it again next week, just as a reminder and invitation. So if you want to step into that, if you want to know more about baptism while we practice it, what it looks like, we'd love to talk to you about that at the Respond banner this morning. But we just want to encourage you like to allow that to be part of your active remembrance, right? That God doesn't just give us words to say, he gives us something to step into, that we bodily participate just as we intellectually participate. Does that make sense? In the restoration and redemption of all things. So if you want to step into that this morning, we'd love to do that. We can fill it up with warm water in a minute. So just let us know. We'd love to do that. Let me pray for us and we'll take communion together. Lord, we love you. Jesus, I feel in some ways the weight of talking about something that you did that was so significant and beautiful and glorious so long ago, and how that translates to our like current moment. God, I just pray that you would this morning, that you would work through your Holy Spirit in this place to remind us that we are a people who have been literally saved, literally bought with blood. Not figuratively, not as an idea, Jesus, but in reality. That we don't just tell the story of King David who brought the ark to Jerusalem, but this morning we tell the story of King Jesus, who put on flesh, the very presence of God dwelling among us, who lived as you intend all of us to live, free and full of faith, caught up in your mission, Jesus, of bringing heaven to earth, and that you died, and that you lived again on the other side of death. We celebrate that this morning, not as a beautiful picture, a helpful allegory, but as historical fact. And then when it feels like we are dying, you remind us that all who are in you, Jesus, will be brought to resurrection life. Then when we feel powerless, God, your word reminds us the very same power that was at work in your resurrection, King Jesus, is alive and at work in us. The Holy Spirit of God is at work bringing dead things to life. And so this morning, Father, I would pray that you would do that. That you would remind us of your faithfulness in the past. You would sit with us in the present. You would call us into your beautiful future. This morning, Jesus, we thank you for your body that was broken, for your blood that was shed, for the hope that you give us. Yeah, we love you. In your name we pray. Amen.